Gonna start this session now. State of freedom. We're gonna start this session right now. Good morning. Good morning. In the spirit of that beautiful opening keynote by Dr. Janetta Cole, I begin our session with this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. Dubois, the literary man. The Word was his medium, letters his clay, paint, found objects, and so on. He was a master of the arts. He sits now with Brother Willie Shakespeare, who jokes with him, hey, you know I inspired your name. He moves arm in arms with Messieurs Balzac and Dumas. He summons Aristotle and Aurelius, and they come to him not with scorn or condescension, but with an eagerness to exchange ideas and to engage what is going on in this world. We have already had wonderful introductions through Dr. Cole's opening to all of our guest scholars and artists, certainly with the artist in her presentation. I direct you to our program for the additional information so we might use all of our time to draw from them and get some thoughts from them in this section. The only one not covered in Dr. Cole amongst the scholars on the panel here is my good friend, Raylan Rabaka, and he is well known for those of us who study Dubois for his many works in that area, as well as on Fanon, as well as on a forthcoming work now on Amilcar Cabral. So definitely look in the program at all the bios on these wonderful co-panelists of mine here. I'd like to get things started by posing a question. I stayed up last night reading the wonderful essay that Akwame Mike Thelwell offered to us here, Dubois in his time and ours, all motion is not progress. And the particular piece of this on page 2 that he writes that I pose for an opening question for discussion here. Ikweme writes, but he would also perceive as though through a glass darkly something else, something real if elusive, for which nothing in his education, experience, or prevailing discourses of the day had prepared him, or given him any language to articulate or fully process. All around him he detected many signs of a distinctive black culture, only dimly perceived, but tantalizingly indicative of something real, present, and consequential, which he would later refer to as the soul of black folk. I ask my co-panelists, in the context of this exhibition, in the context of their own work, is there such a thing today as a soul of black folk, as a distinctive culture, a set of cultural truths, a speaking to our world of a black culture that is real, that is present, that is consequential, and that we as scholars and artists have a duty in the legacy of Du Bois to engage, to defend, and to build. Let's start right here from my left and move on down the panel. Brother Jefferson, please.
I feel like it's our job to not necessarily carry this weight. I feel like there is a culture and there's just an incredible well of blackness that a lot of us dip into and pull from the resources of. But is there like one overall overarching definition or the way to interpret all of this information? I would say that's not necessarily my job. I feel like it's important for me, as Dubois says, to represent truth. And I'm riffing off of that and trying to understand, well, what is my truth? And how can I, dig within the artist identity and expand upon that? I mean, it's, I am a black artist, and that's first and foremost. I mean, I feel like, in some way that for years I thought of myself as being an artist first, but I think in the society in which we live, I mean, it's a lot more complicated than that. I think about in the media and the way that blackness is interpreted. I think it can be often misguided, and I think that there's a whole bunch of representations that, quite honestly, I don't abide or I don't buy into. But for me, my job, I think, is just trying to understand, myself within the context of this society and this environment. For me, I know it's I work with images. In some way, I work with people, and I work with these ideas. But at the same time, I don't know if I can jump into it and describe it. Maybe not, obviously, not as articulately as I would want to. But for me, it comes from the heart. It comes from the gut, and understanding, I guess, my own truths, and then going out from there. Yeah.
Right now, actually, I'm a minister in a very predominantly black LGBT Pentecostal church. That's how I knew your song. And coming from 5, 6 generations of New Englanders in rural Maine, I feel like I'm home today. I can testify that the soul of black folk is alive and well, and one thing that must be done, and I've discovered this, and I can testify after 30 years of working with my predominantly Latino and black students and participants in KOS. Angel Abreu here is one of the veterans. He's like my son. The souls of black folk are alive and well, and what is really important is, especially white Americans have got to start discovering their own black souls. It's part of their life, it's part of the language, it's part of the mindset. Instead of constantly avoiding it, or being polite about it, or not even acknowledging the amazing influence that black folk have on our life, and our collective spirit, and our aesthetic, and everything that we do and we make. And basically, that's all there is to it. There's a great gospel star named Hezekiah Walker, who has a wonderful song, I Need You to Survive. And I do, I need you to survive. We all need each other to survive. And the great thing about what we do in terms of visual art is it's a welcome table. Every day is a day of Thanksgiving because we would not all be here together if it wasn't for the exhibition, it wasn't for the works of the scholars, it wasn't for the wonderful people at this great university that got us all together. It's a big Thanksgiving Day dinner, and I'm glad about it.
In terms of whether there's such a thing as a black soul and whether we move from that position, I think in terms of Dubois, I think that Dubois was always quite prophetic, that he seemed to be able to touch on things before they actually happen. And so whether there's a such thing as a black soul that we use as a point of departure, I would say perhaps he would remix that today, where there's an even greater emphasis on the Africanity of so-called black people. And I think that Du Bois was interesting in his ability to connect the past to the present to actually talk about the futurity, if you will, of black folk. And today there's a greater emphasis on not so much, quote unquote, a color, even though obviously blackness was so much more than a color, about culture. And so now there's this greater emphasis on connecting continental Africa with the African diaspora, hence Africana, hence the title of one of his last great works, Encyclopedia Africana. And so I think that there would be probably, he would remix, if you will, and deconstruct a blackness. And at the other end of that is something that he started in 1909 with the whole Encyclopedia Africana, where there would be a greater emphasis on the Africanity. That right now, if we look at somebody like Walter White in the NAACP, who blonde hair, blue eyes early in his life, he was black. And so we actually began to call into question, if you will, blackness, but not necessarily soul. And I think that this is what we're talking about when we talk about the African Holocaust, when we talk about the Middle Passage, when we talk about the enslavement of African people, when we talk about colonization, when we talk about segregation, Jim Crow, Jane Crow, lynching, these kinds of things. These are efforts at dehumanizing a whole group of people, and the soulfulness of it is the ways in which we sort of speak our special truth, even in the face of the most insurmountable odds. That's soulful. And in that sense, I think we see glimpses of, if you will, the resilience of the human spirit, not simply obviously in the African world, but Du Bois was allowing us to make connections with other parts of the world, hence Du Bois as a revolutionary humanist. But we're never going to be able to see the humanity and appreciate the humanity of other people if we're not able to actually embrace and explore and celebrate our own humanity. And I don't want to, I'm going to quote Theolonus Monk, but the ugly beauty of blackness in the 21st century. Sometimes it's not all pretty, it's squeaky clean, and it's not all socially acceptable to the black bourgeoisie. You know, I'm of course referencing hip hop here. You know, I think that if Du Bois was here, there might be connections, obviously, that he could make from the Harlem Renaissance to the hip-hop generation. And let me remind you that Zora Neale Hurston, a lot of what she was doing was considered quite vulgar to some people, some of the well-to-do new Negroes, right? And a lot of what Langston Hughes was doing was considered quite vulgar as well. Why? Because they saw a lot of the soulfulness, if you will, of our people to actually come up from the vernacular culture, from the masses and the working classes. And I think that it's interesting to go to the museum and to actually look at the art, because a lot of it does seem to be, there's like this subtext that comes up, if you will. So instead of top down, it was bottom up. And I think that Du Bois lived long enough to actually reverse his talented tent, which in 1948 he dubbed the Guiding 100. But actually nobody really reads Du Bois after 1903 anymore. I better stop. That was the year. Woo! I better stop. It's too early in the morning, but 1903 was the year he publishes The Souls of Black Folk and the Talented Tenth, but in 1903, W.B. Du Bois was only 35 years old. So that means that most people actually intellectually assassinate Du Bois at 35, and they never ask the question, what did he do the last 60 years of his life? And when I look at the art over there, when I walk through, there's something that happens inside of me that resonates deeply and profoundly inside of me, because I think that we get a glimpse at the evolution of Du Bois. And I'll end by saying, you can't kill a spirit. You can't kill a soul. So his body is gone, but his spirit continues to inspire us in so many different ways.
I don't know if I should say anything else after that. I think maybe you've tapped it out. I will just wait for the next question. I absolutely think that, first of all, I'm really honored to be here, to be back in this part of the world. I taught here for a long time. It's wonderful to see friends and colleagues in the audience and people who have guided me and who've helped me make my work possible. So I wanted to start with that. Secondly, I think that absolutely we have, when he said that he saw something stirring, that he went down south and he saw us. That continues. That hasn't changed. There's nothing, in a way, for me, it's like a moot point. That I can't write out of, I can't make out of, I can't create out of anything other than my black human spirit. I can't do that. So it doesn't even matter anymore, you know, in that sort of way. You know, that this thing that we are drawing on is so deep, so blue-black, so complex, so gorgeous, so powerful, so overwhelming. Hallelujah. Right? That there's no place else for me to go but to celebrate that. And for me now, the work is, how do I, as an artist, I absolutely believe that we have major responsibility. That is the burden that I carry. That is the burden that I want, right? That I don't want to shuck that responsibility, right? That he opened up this path for us to walk on. That's where I plan to walk. So that, you know, within the beauty about our situation, our circumstance, the thing that my father, uneducated as he was, taught me was that I had right. That I had a right to be. That I had a right to make. That black, brown, green, yellow didn't matter. That every day, each man, each woman must rise, put on their pants or their dress, and hit it, right? Every day. And that if anybody messed with you, black, brown, red, yellow, then you picked up the biggest stick you could and you beat them with that. Right. So, you know, so now my project is how do I celebrate Du Bois? How do I celebrate that legacy? How do I make that legacy my legacy? Not Carrie's legacy, but our legacy. How do we participate in that? And so I thought, you know what? Most people know very little about Du Bois, right? Most people know very little about this man. But when I thought about doing this exhibition, I thought, you know, there are no contemplative spaces for African Americans, really. There are very, very, very few. I was sitting in this beautiful contemplative space, a garden, and I thought, where is one for us? I thought, wouldn't it be beautiful to have a contemplative space named for Du Bois that we could participate in, that people over the next 100 years, 200 years, 300 years could go to think about this man and or other issues. And then I thought, perhaps I could name a flower for Du Bois. And that way then I could have hundreds, maybe even thousands of people participating with the idea of Du Bois and the idea of hope and aspiration in an ongoing way, that indeed you could plant that hope in your garden and watch it bloom year after year after year after year after year after year after year. So that is my project. I have a deep feeling of responsibility to myself and therefore to Du Bois to make it happen. Hopefully it will happen here at the University of Amherst, here not far away in a memorial garden. But the flower is available and you can order the peony of hope and you can plant it in your garden. There are flyers that are outside, and I really do hope that you will take them and you can start ordering them now.
On page 4 of Ekweme Michael Thelwell's essay, he raises something that I think is particularly important because in our present times of the assault on government and no one wants to pay taxes, I guess that's in all times, but less and less support from government for what we do here, and more out of the pockets of students themselves and their families. We think of, we want to think about our students. We want to think about our young people. And Thelwell writes that about this moment in Du Bois's life in Germany, and he's sort of reflecting on his education and where he's at, and he writes, but for a young Negro American, without affluent and influential family connections, the issue of a people but one generation removed from bondage. And at the time of writing, this piece he wrote at 25 years old, without a job or even the prospects of one, he proposed to take the world, and what a world, in his hands and work to ensure the rise of his people. Driven, in his words, by, quote, pride of race, lineage, and self, and armed, as his best biographer wrote, only with a brain, a pen, and audacity, one can add to that an almost superhuman determination, discipline, and focus, tireless effort, and uncommon longevity. How, in what we are doing, are we inspiring? Are we cultivating? Are we setting an example for our young people today to live and to develop that sense of determination, that sense of discipline, and focus to want to live in the way of the life that we've talked about, this intellectualism, this commitment to art and to our world, whichever way you all want to take it.
So let's have a conversation. I mean, what's the real question that we're really asking about our role as artists, our role as educators, our role as, for some of you, public intellectuals? Is that the question?
And particularly with its resonance, its impact, its promise for our young people, for those coming up today.
I work with fifth graders and I work with graduate students. And out of all I'm not a teacher, I'm an educator. A teacher is cool, but they show you stuff. They're a resource. But an educator is different. And I started being an educator about 20 years ago out of the necessity of the critical and very distressed situation in the South Bronx in that day. And education comes from educare. It means to draw. You have to draw from as if you're drawing water from a well, which I did as a kid, or to be born by a golden river, which I also was, like Dubois was. But I think the most essential thing is the fact that Dubois was a doer of the word. And that's what we must do, by example. We must be the doer of the word. It's wonderful to publish, yes. It's wonderful to have symposiums like this. But you know what's even more wonderful? And this is what I'm almost certain, when the young W.E.B. Du Bois took a break and taught those kids in rural Tennessee in his summers, I think it was an amazing spiritual, emotional, intellectual transformation, because it became quite obvious what was to be done.
It's just doing the work. It's doing the work, and the thing that I'm sort of very concerned about. I am concerned about the way in which students, for the most part, seem not to be particularly engaged in a large and a sustained way. And I think that in some instances, one of the things that we're seeing, and I really do applaud the students that are here today on this campus. There are thousands of students. There are very few students here, relatively speaking, to be on a university campus. There's something wrong with that picture, that so few students seem to be really engaged with the moment and with the possibility of what education or what being in an educational environment can really speak to and really offer. So in some ways, I think that there might be something that, of course, the ideas about, about being inspiring, I don't know, I think you just do your work and put it out there as much as possible and let people take from it what they need to take from it. But I think that there is a deeper issue around the question of education that we're really going to have to look at in this country. And I think that the changing role, that there is a shift that's going on in this country, that there's a disruption that's going on in this country. And there's a way in which all of that speaks not only to the question of education, but ultimately the collapse of the country itself, that I feel that the country itself is undergoing some major slip, major slippage, and that education in some weird way is going with it. And so thinking about education in another way, reframing the discussion around education and what young people need and want now may be really the conversation that needs to be had ultimately.
I think that whenever we think about Du Bois, it seems to me that over his long life, Du Bois actually makes a distinction between being an academic and being an intellectual. Academics, most of their work is quarantined to the academy. They drive through communities to get to the campus, but they don't really, okay, I'm gonna stop. He has a famous quote about driving through the community, but I won't say it because it's a little unflattering. But, so it's really, really important to see that I believe that, Du Bois really makes a strong distinction between, the academics and a bona fide intellectual. An intellectual is somebody who, not only do you love knowledge, but you want to share and produce knowledge that's actually going to transform not simply yourself, but the world that you live in. And in that sense, education is transformative. Du Bois was born in a very, very humble environment, and he was able to develop himself, transform himself into this world historical figure that we're talking about today. And so it becomes really kind of interesting to sort of think about. And so that's one issue. Another issue is just the whole relevance of a lot of the curriculum today. For some reason, those people, most of my students remain between the ages of 18 and 21. I have to make a compelling case as to why they need to know about World War I or the Middle Passage or the Civil Rights Movement or the Women's Liberation Movement. I have to make a compelling case, and I just feel like there's a sense in which I want to sort of I want to make sure that Du Bois's legacy goes on after I'm long gone. And in order to do that, that means I'm going to have to be able to not only appreciate, but critique sort of what's happening right here, right now, a lot of which they're deeply invested in. At least most of my students are deeply invested in a lot of the stuff. And so there's like a fine balance. And in a strange way, I think that Du Bois sort of kept his finger on the pulse. There was lots of issues, obviously, he was a little off on, but he seemed to be able to consistently come up with something very, very unique that was worthy of actually sort of sharing, and it did inspire generation after generation after generation of people. How else could he live 95 years and consistently sort of seem cutting edge?
In terms of your work now, what did this man mean for you? Because that's one of the sort of questions, the literary man. What did this man mean for you? And anybody can answer that question.
Growing up, in a very rough neighborhood and everything, Du Bois's work, I first got exposed to Du Bois in junior high school, The Souls of Black Folk.
Right.
It was the first book that I ever saw in my life with a black person on the cover. And so I stared at the cover of the book thinking, how did he get on the cover of the book? What did he do? What did he have to do? I'm like 11 or 12 years old, and I'm shocked. I'm just standing there, and the librarian came and thumped me in the back of the head and said, you're supposed to read the books, not look at the books. And I don't know if I thought that he was actually going to talk back after a while. And I didn't realize that he was already passed on, or whatever. So for me, that had a very profound impact in the way that she said his name, Dr. Du Bois. And if you check that book out, Raylan, you better bring that book back. What's up with that? So anyway, and I don't pretend to have understood all of what he said in there, but there was something that resonated with me, having grown up in a highly religious household, obviously. It was very sort of, there was something sacred about it. And it seemed to be very reminiscent, if you will, of some of the passages from the Bible that I had been exposed to and so on and so forth. And so for me, I think that he sort of, he provided a point of departure. He sort of set the tone for certain things. And then when I found out that he had influenced Martin Luther King Jr., among lots of other figures, it made sense to sort of think about some kind of classical tradition. And I think that as an artist myself, I think that I keep toggling between tradition and innovation. And I think that we have a lot of people who are either they're steeped in the tradition and they don't want to hear nothing about no innovation, or they're so interested in innovation, they actually have no sense of the tradition. And I think that what I want to try to find a balance. And I think that that's really important.
I was having this just really wonderful conversation last night, with Horst, and we were talking about Dubois and some of his imperfections. And I think that kind of gave a wonderful gravity to an understanding. I think we're, as much as we appreciate and respect all the wonderful things he's done, I think what I tell you what I've been really enjoying is to find out how imperfect.
You mean that he was a man?
That he was a that he was a man and he was a person and that he had real problems that he had to overcome and I think what was really wonderful is like we're all dealing with life and all these various elements of being human and how he had all of these things that would have held back or excuses he could have had for not being able to achieve, but somehow he was able to be great in in light of all the other things that was going on in his life and
in his time.
In his time, that's right. Like in 1911, and he wrote this wonderful pageant, the Star of Ethiopia. And I'm thinking that after reading it, having a really hard time understanding. I mean, I had to read the thing like 4 or 5 times before it really started to sink in. And I'm wondering, what was it about this creative work that was so compelling to me? Is that in some regard, people were watching this thing, and I'm not sure how much the audience was understanding. I mean, he was having a conversation, but at the same time, he knew that this was important information, and he had to present it to the people, and he had to present it in a way that people could understand, but at the same, it wasn't as if that, these moments were clear to the public. I mean, even reading it and trying, reading and rereading again and having the benefit of Black History Month for, 42 years, I still was trying to understand the relationship with the characters. But I think that almost like an artistic sense, it was like he was presenting the information and allowing it to disseminate and taking the time for it to sink in. That there were as many perfect things about this piece, there were imperfect things. And I think that I've been really enjoying understanding that he was human, So.
Yes.
My name is Jamila Wilson, and thank you so much to all the panelists, especially, of course, Kara May Weems. It's a pleasure to have you here. And even more, the words that you're offering really speak to my understanding of Dr. Du Bois as a scholar activist. And when you speak, Professor Rabaka, on tradition and innovation, I think of Du Bois highly representing that. Again, at 90 plus years old in 1960, writing Whither Now and Why, and saying that in 1960, in order for the US to have democracy, the Negro must lead. So I kind of want to hear all of your perspective on Dr. Du Bois as a scholar activist, beyond an intellectual, but a scholar activist who spoke to the times, spoke to what was happening in those moments that he existed, and beyond speaking to it, urged and demanded, pleaded for for the people to represent that, to fight for democracy, fight for humanity. So if you all could just speak on what it means for you as a scholar activist, and if you identify yourself as a scholar activist.
Before they start to answer, can we get one other question in?
My name is Kelly Morgan. I'm a 4th-year grad student in the Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies. Like my colleague before me, I'd just like to thank you all for being here. That was a wonderful commentary. And something that really stood out to me was the conversation that you had around Dr. Shabazz's first question and second question, this idea of a soul and this idea of how people perceive that soul. And I was reading recently about how people visualize blackness, the visuality of blackness and the visibility of blackness. As a future curator and professor myself, like I kind of struggle with that in my classes when I use your work and so many other Black artists' work to explain these sort of like moral lessons to people and historical lessons to people, and they don't value it. So it's like when they receive sort of what we know as blackness, what we understand and love and cherish, they see it as either unimportant, or they see it as in a way in which, Zimmerman perceived Trayvon. Trayvon was not performing blackness. He was being himself. But he was perceived and understood in this very violent and threatening way. So my question is, how do we use art in a didactic form or a pedagogical form to change the way people see us? So where they see where they begin to see an inherent humanity and not a popular stereotype or misconception of blackness.
That is the work. That's the work. I said, that's the work. And I absolutely understand the depth of the question, and it's a question and an answer that I feel endlessly engaged with in my life and in the work that I make. I think that the young sister who's just spoke before you is absolutely right. I think that one of the great powers, sort of the unintended consequences of our condition here in America is that we have this incredible sense of, and this urge, and this longing for freedom. And to that extent, then, we lead the sort of the charge for democracy in a very, very interesting and dynamic way. And how to reveal that, or rather, I should say that it's revealed. Some people are blind to the sight. So that is, a perceptual problem that's based on many things that we all know most about. But that's a perceptual problem that we have to negotiate and always be mindful of that negotiation. However, I'm having like a very interesting meeting with a group of people in Silicon Valley. I pulled together this group of all these sort of like amazing people that have been working in the field of, like President Barack Obama became, President Barack Obama because of social media, really, and sort of an extraordinary group of people that were really working around issues of social media to make that happen, a lot of them in Silicon Valley. And I thought it would be really wonderful to sit down with a group of people and have them really help me think about how do we sort of advance the issue around blackness and black productivity and visibility and artistic involvement. So I'm kind of working on those levels.
I'm going to keep my comments brief. I think that when we think about Du Bois as a scholar activist, I'd even like to add artist. I think it was a scholar, artist, activist. I think it's important to get the aesthetic dimension in there. But I think that his crowning achievement in this area would be the fact that Du Bois left the academy and founded the NAACP. Or helped to found it, right? One of the founding members of the NAACP, arguably one of the greatest civil rights organizations in the history of our nation. And so I think that we have to use our scholarship. We don't have a choice. I mean, I hate to sound like Paulo Freire in Brazil, but I mean, when he talks about the pedagogy of the oppressed, oppressed groups look at education, should look at education qualitatively different than the people who might be attempting to uphold the status quo. Du Bois consistently critiqued the status quo. And so that means to be a Du Boisian intellectual, artist, activist, we don't understand any sort of neutrality. The second I walk into the room, Frantz Fanon says, my blackness walks in with me. They hear drums. They project all this stuff on, even on days that I don't think of myself as black. I mean, when I wake up in the morning, I don't say, yo, what's up, black? I don't think of myself in racial terms, but the second I walk out of my house in Boulder, Colorado, hallelujah, help me, Jesus. So that's one. Two, when we talk about this whole notion of sort of the soul and the expressivity of blackness, the reality of the matter is that most of us, our parents have to pay $25,000, $35,000, $45,000 a year for us to ever even have our first African American studies class. There is something wrong with the American education system that claims to be multicultural, but it's really monocultural. They're only really teaching one culture, right? And it's this sort of triumphalist narrative. It's this narrative, that just keeps going on and on and on. And what they throw off in there is a couple of token brown people every now and then, and they throw in a couple of token women, and now they're going to start pushing a couple of token homosexuals, and you're going to think you actually learned something. But you have to come to a very cushy place out here, all the way out here in Amherst, to get some African American. I'm Shabbat, I ain't going to get you fired, though. Watch, I'm not going to say nothing. I'm finna quit. I know Bill out there somewhere. I ain't going to say nothing there. Watch, I'm finna be quiet, though. Watch this, though. I'm not going to come undone on this podium. Okay? But I think it's ridiculous when we start talking about curriculum, because what we have to have is a decolonization of the curriculum. And in fact, oh boy, I'm about to get started. Watch this, watch. Here we go. Wait, watch this. Woo! Watch this now. We will never be able to achieve liberation until we first have decolonization. And in fact, the United States of America began as 13 colonies. Somebody gonna hear me one day.
All right. In the interest of preserving my employment, let's pick up these two comments, and then we must, and we'll get our panel, any of our panel, and then we must turn it over to the next round of session on art and politics.
We're gonna have a good time, baby. Horace, how you doing?
Very well. It is one of the beautiful things about being part of this incredible symposium exhibition is getting to hang out with friends and interlocutors who, me being a young scholar and curator, I am indebted to. So many times I'll say thank you. And since this panel specifically is entitled The Literary Man, my question is, what are the texts that the five of you hold as sacred? Because the one thing that I feel that Du Bois's voice does in words is to not make right or wrong ethical and moral statements, although Lord knows his training in Hegel and Schlegel and Kant and Schiller would allow him to do so. He never does. He turns it back to the audience and says, "This is my truth from which I am speaking. Give me your truths." So I'm wondering, as we have in the museum gorgeous examples of artists and thinkers working through a process that they have crafted and making art of Du Bois and us from their truths, where do you go to text to find truth?
I think I'm directing my question more to Professor Weems. And as one who wears a collar and one who has a very strong commitment to the contemplative life, how you were proposing a garden perhaps here at a university and in a college setting, but when you begin to bring the public into the sphere of that connection with the academy and the contemplative, how would you envision that happening?
I've actually, my entire exhibition is really based on the garden design that I've made along with the wonderful landscape architect, Walter Hood. So the design is in place, the flowers are in place. It is, it's one of the things that I would actually love to see happen, frankly, is that I would love to see the school and the Du Bois Center here on campus really get behind the project. That I want to see African Americans step up to the plate and support the idea of a contemplative garden for Du Bois. The 1964 Alumni Association has agreed to fund part of the garden, but I think that it's very important that we put up our money, our time, our energy, our effort. And that's a part of the sort of activism that I think is actually really important, that we can all be involved in any number of ways, whether it's buying a flower or donating $5, whatever it is, but being a part of that effort, I think, is absolutely essential. That it becomes our responsibility to make sure that these kinds of projects, if we want contemplative spaces for somebody like Du Bois, right? I was just at Frederick Douglass's home just the other day in Washington. Fabulous, beautiful, 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 right? And, you know, it has to be maintained. I'm thinking that I'm looking towards my audience and saying, come forward, step forward, be involved, participate in something that's real and permanent for ourselves.
I know I've mentioned Star of Ethiopia before, but you know, it's wonderful when you find a gem. And in 1915, when Du Bois produced the Star of Ethiopia in Washington, D.C., I think it was a really important year because he was combating the birth of a nation. I mean, he had this archaic 19th century media of pageantry, where there was no, concrete script. There was gesturing. People were coming on stage with costumes. But he was, there's letters where he was talking about how important it was for him to do something against, arguably, one of the biggest feats of technology of its time is to create like a piece like Birth of a Nation, where, Woodrow Wilson said it, this is like history, being written with a bolt of lightning, and then in Du Bois it's like, well, no, it's not. And I'm going to show you in a 19th century art form, starting, in 1915, he was like, I'm going to show you in this old style where I'm just going to get the community together. I'm going to get individuals together, people who aren't performers, who aren't actors, to be able to articulately stand up and to teach a 10,000-year history of the black race in 3 hours with 300 people on stage. I think if people are like, well, do you ever think about what would be great to mount a production of The Star of Ethiopia? And I was like, well, if I ever made a movie, it wouldn't be of The Star of Ethiopia, it would be the making of The Star of Ethiopia, because, how do you get, 300 people, in, a baseball stadium, to perform? And when you read about this, it's like 200 people singing "Oh Freedom" at the same time, and this is, predates, anybody even putting, this kind of history together. So if that's not, social activism, in a way that it was just like, you have to read this and you have to really actively use your imagination to try to imagine what it was like for people who had never heard these stories before. And, Sojourner Truth on stage asking Frederick Douglass, is there God? And when he references slavery, he's saying Christian slavery. I think there were probably audible gasps, you know what I mean?
Even today.
Yes, and then he's talking about Islam, but when he talks about Islam, he gives it the dignity that people, can't even give that kind of dignity to Islam today, and Du Bois is like, no, our race spread Islam throughout the world. Let's talk about it. So, for me, when I think about activism and scripts that have really influenced my work, and when David Glassberg introduced me to that piece of writing and just the research that it took to get a hold of it. One last thing, Colonel Charles Young, who was the highest ranked officer at this time, graduate of West Point, designed the music for The Star of Ethiopia. I think Du Bois understood that you didn't necessarily have to be an artist to be able to create artistically. And I'm going to leave it with that, is that, all of our contributions are important, and as activists, I think we have to figure out how we can contribute.
Art really simply means to make, and at its best it is, to echo everyone here, it's freedom made visible and material, and that's why it's so threatening to so many people, if it's not in their particular interest. And getting back, when we made our work in collaboration with 18 5th, 6th, and 7th graders in Springfield at the Renaissance Charter School. Not obviously, but they did not have that connect to Du Bois that, let's say, Angel had at the age of 14. He's precocious. And I might have had something to do with it. But when we decided what to do, we had to go to his masterpiece, Dark Water, which many people haven't read. And it is a total work of art. It's, but the Golden River, and a great essay called The Immortal Child towards the end. But it's that credo. What I did is the kids memorized parts of the credo, and then I gave them a little time to write their own credo. In a half hour, they wrote what they felt their life's purpose was and their belief was. And it was astonishing. But I have to go along with the influence of Du Bois' credo, where he believes in God, he believes in the Negro, he believes in pride, he believes in service, he believes in the devil, and he believes in Jesus. He believes in liberty, he believes in children, because he made art in the future tense. And he believed in a radical patience.
And was therefore ostracized for all of that. And was therefore, I mean, this is the thing that's so sort of extraordinary about sort of sitting here and thinking about this man who ultimately doesn't live his life here in the United States, right? Who has a very difficult time living out his life in the United States for those ideas, right? You know, that he's banished. You know, that he is considered a socialist, a communist, a spy, an agent of, provocateur for the Russians. You know, that he cannot be a man of liberty. This is so deep to me, that he cannot be a man of liberty and live here. You know? And that is, I think, one of the things that's sort of amazing about, you know, the courage that really this man had. The courage to be, and again, whether you he was a man who cared ultimately. I don't know if he was like a public intellectual or an artist, but he was a man who cared, who engaged himself, involved himself with his moment and his time, and that we can celebrate him today, I think is absolutely wonderful. That we don't really stand in his light, I think, in very critical ways. Politically, I think is also telling, right? That our politics at this point, you know, have been so buttressed. It's been so attacked that I have absolutely no idea what anybody's politics are anymore. Right? The courage of Du Bois and his example, in fact, was that he was not afraid to stand on his politics, even when there were many of those who disagreed around him. You know, that he was forced out of the NAACP for some of his beliefs, if I'm not mistaken, right? So these are like, you know, very, very important things. And I think that, you know, as I look out at our audience in this place, you know, where universities have also been under attack as liberal, left-wing institutions for the fostering of certain kinds of radical ideas, right? At the same time, we also know from this brutal attack from the right for the last 20 years, over the last 20 years, that our deeper politics, our deeper commitment to social change, our deeper belief that in fact capitalism, imperialism, colonialism must necessarily be dismantled if freedom is to rise, I think is important. I think it's important that we don't even use those terms anymore. I think that Du Bois would be very, very, very upset with us, that we have, you know, refused to go head on, head first, really with the deeper issues of the destructive power of capital and how it has ruined so many lives, and where black people are contemporarily with their lives absolutely in shatters, living below, many of us below the poverty line, still, yet and still.
For me, the Philadelphia Negro, a touchstone work of Du Bois's. He helps to inaugurate sociology in the United States of America with that work. The Souls of Black Folk, obviously, for so many different reasons, but just the fact that he basically creates a genre where somebody could sort of wax poetic as well, didn't always have to come down in the stiff, sort of sterile voice of a scholar. And he sort of showed us, I mean, he sort of really prefigures a lot of African American studies writing today. Dark Water, a book in which he not only has the beautiful essay called The Damnation of Women, where he comes out strong for women getting the right to vote, and in fact the book was published 1920, the year that women got the right to vote. Women haven't even had the right to vote for 100 years. I just said it out loud. In America, not in Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan, not in Syria, in the United States of America, so-called democratic society. So Dark Water, very, very important. Also in Dark Water, Du Bois publishes The Souls of White Folk, which most people actually completely overlook. So Du Bois actually helps to lay the foundation for critical white studies He don't get the credit for that either, because again, everybody's sort of looking at Du Bois only from a race man point of view. I thought that was very, very fascinating. I was also profoundly touched by The World in Africa. Du Bois is sort of more a very depthful, brilliant, brilliant conception of African history. And then lastly, In Battle for Peace by W.B. Du Bois. A lot of people don't realize in 1952, Du Bois was put in jail. He's 83 years old. They throw him in jail in his own country. And in fact, they take his books out of most libraries, burn them. He's harassed. They take his visa away from him. This is McCarthyism. I mean, they completely, you know, Langston Hughes, one of the first people to get to the jail. He's there weeping. Du Bois is in the jail, said, "Why are you crying? I'm in the jail." You know, so it becomes really, really kind of interesting. And then last but certainly not least, the autobiography of W.B. Du Bois profoundly changed my life. I read it in high school along with the autobiography of Malcolm X and the autobiography of Angela Davis. I mean, these are all they sort of opened me up to a radical imagination, how I could, even though I, you know, was in the projects and I was living my life in squalor, these people allowed me to sort of imagine a better self and a better world. Thank you.
Thank you. Please thank the panel. Let's segue to the next panel on art and politics.